The diner was buzzing with laughter, forks clinking against plates, and the usual hum of casual conversations. In a quiet corner near the window, an elderly black man sat alone, hands trembling as he tried to lift his coffee cup. The cup slipped, slightly teetered, then fell shattering against the tiled floor. Heads turned. A few teenagers near the counter snickered. A waitress rolled her eyes and whispered to a coworker, "Somebody needs to tell Grandpa to stay home." The old man didn't react. He simply stared down at the broken porcelain and the spilled coffee soaking into his worn military-style coat. His fingers twitched slightly, betraying a lifetime of struggle that no one in the room seemed to notice or care to understand. His eyes were cloudy, not just from age, but from something deeper. A pain buried under decades of silence. And still, he said nothing. No excuses. No anger. Just quiet dignity in the face of mockery. Then the door opened. A sharp breeze entered. With a young man in full military uniform, Lieutenant Marcus Williams had only come in for a quick lunch after visiting his grandfather's grave. But his eyes locked instantly on the old man. Not his face. Not the spilled coffee. But something else had faded, barely visible, tattoo on. His shaking forearm, Marcus froze. His breath caught. He stepped closer, "Sir," he whispered, eyes wide. "Is that?" 761st. His voice trembled. He knew that symbol. He'd seen it in a photo once, on the arm of a legend. The diner fell silent. Elijah. Turner was born in the red clay fields of 1930s rural Georgia, in a town so small it barely made it onto maps. He came into a world that saw the color of his skin before the content of his character, time when segregation wasn't just law, it was culture. His family, descendants of sharecroppers, and the invisible labor that built much of the South, lived in a weathered wooden shack on the edge of a cotton field. His father, Isaac, worked sunup to sundown in a lumber mill that paid him pennies, while his mother, Lillian, cleaned homes for white families who never learned her name. Yet, within that home, despite the cracked walls and the bitter cold winters, there was warmth, pride, and love. Elijah, even as a boy, carried an old soul. He wasn't loud or boastful. He had a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. He loved to take things apart just to figure out how they work, radios, clocks, and anything mechanical. His fingers moved with a kind of grace that belied his young age, and by the time he was 11, he was already fixing tractors and mending broken engines for the local farmers who couldn't afford repairs. But it wasn't just machines music, lived in his hands too. On Sunday evenings, after church and cornbread dinners, Elijah would sit on the porch with a second-hand harmonica and play soft, soulful blues while the fireflies danced under the Georgia stars. Everyone said he had gifted hands that healed things. What no one could see, not even him, was that life would one day take that gift and shake it to the core. When World War II began, Elijah was barely a teenager. But the headlines of Europe in flames and Hitler's march across the world made their way even into the segregated schools and churches of Georgia. The idea that black men could fight for a country that still refused to serve them equally was complicated. But for Elijah, it was simple. He wasn't fighting just for America. He was fighting for dignity. At just 16, with a forged birth certificate and his father's worn-out boots on his feet, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. His voice didn't crack when he said his name to the recruiter. His hands didn't shake then. Signed to the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, Elijah entered a brotherhood few knew existed. The 761st was one of the first all-black armored units in U.S. history. A unit that would go on to fight in some of the bloodiest battles in Europe while still being denied basic respect by the very nation they served. Even within the Army, they were called names, given outdated equipment, and forced to sleep in segregated quarters. But that didn't stop them. It never stopped Elijah. He trained as a mechanic and tank operator, quickly earning the respect of his fellow soldiers not through words, but through action. His hands, those same hands that once coaxed life out of broken radios and rusted Tractors now kept massive tanks running under enemy fire. During a brutal winter campaign in France, his crew's Sherman tank was ambushed and disabled by artillery. The driver was unconscious. Fire licked at the fuel lines. Through the air, Elijah, wounded in the shoulder, crawled out through the hatch, pulled his driver to safety, and manually extinguished the fire with a tarp soaked in slush and gasoline. When the smoke cleared and the medics arrived, Elijah didn't even mention the pain in his side. He just sat beside the tank, eyes closed, his breath steady, waiting for orders. He would later repeat this act of bravery 2 more times, once pulling a trapped squad leader from beneath a collapsed tank tread, and again when he drove 3 miles under sniper fire to deliver fuel to a stranded unit. His valor didn't go unnoticed. The Army awarded him the Bronze Star, but the recognition ended there. He never received the same parade welcomes, the interviews, or the front-page honors given to white soldiers. His medal came in a manila envelope, mailed to his family home. There was no ceremony. When the war ended, Elijah came home to a country that had forgotten him. No one asked about the tattoo inked on his arm, the unit symbol of the 761st. No. One knew how many lives he had saved, how many battles he had endured. The factories wouldn't hire him. He was told he was too unqualified, or that the jobs had already been filled. At restaurants, he still had to use the colored entrance. On buses, he sat in the back. His brothers in arms were scattered. Lost in the chaos of post-war America, many dying young from poverty, alcohol, or the mental wounds no one treated. Elijah, he kept moving. Took a job as a janitor at a local high school, quietly sweeping floors where he once dreamed of building machines. At night, he still played the harmonica, though the songs were softer, sadder. He never married. Some say it was because of a girl who died while he was overseas. Others believe the war changed him too much to love in the way he once could. But those who knew him saw a man full of grace, who never let bitterness take root. Years passed. His hands, once steady and sure, began to tremble. It started with small things, buttons, zippers, spilled coffee. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a slow, cruel erosion of everything that once defined him, but he never complained. Even when he couldn't tie his shoes. Even when he dropped his harmonica and couldn't pick it up, he still smiled. At children on the street, still fixed old lawnmowers when he could, still stood when the national anthem played wobbly, but proud. He never told anyone about the war. Not really. A few teachers at the school knew he was a veteran, but none understood what that meant. He kept the tattoo on his arm covered most of the time, not out of shame, but because no one asked. He had learned that in this world, some stories are too heavy for people to carry, and so Elijah Turner, the man whose hands once held the fate of men in battle, became invisible. He moved through life like a ghost seen, but not known, heard but not truly listened to. Until that one afternoon in a diner no one remembered the name of, his hand trembled over a coffee cup, and a young lieutenant saw more than just a man with shaky fingers. He saw a legacy, saw sacrifice. He saw history. The diner wasn't anything special, just one of those off the highway. Small-town spots where the linoleum floors were scuffed with decades of shoes. The coffee was cheap and bitter, and the jukebox in the corner hadn't worked. Since the early 2000s, it was the kind of place where regulars knew. The waitresses by name and newcomers got side glances if they didn't order fast enough. On this particular cloudy Tuesday afternoon, the booths were half filled. The scent of burnt toast and hash browns hung in the air, and the dull clatter of cutlery formed the background rhythm. In the corner, sitting by the window in a booth meant for 2, was Mr. Elijah Turner. His presence didn't stir much notice at first. Just an old black man, in an outdated, faded military-style jacket, hunched slightly from years of hard living. With hands that trembled as though the air itself weighed too much, he sat quietly, sipping slowly from a chipped coffee mug, eyes lowered, as if trying to disappear into the vinyl cushion beneath him. No one knew who he was. No one asked. His coat was worn, his boots had long lost their shine, and his posture made him look smaller than he really was. He was just some old man, the kind most people walk past without ever really seeing. That is, until his hand betrayed him. He reached slowly, carefully, for the sugar jar with those trembling fingers. His knuckles stiff with age and illness. But the muggle ready close to the edge of the table tipped when his wrist gave out. Slightly, in an instant, it slipped from his grasp and crashed onto the tiled floor. The sound was sharp, shattering both the cup and the brief, fragile anonymity he had wrapped around himself. Heads turned. The waitress at the counter muttered a sigh loud enough to be heard. A few young adults seated in the back booth started laughing, mocking chuckles disguised as whispers. One of them nudged his friend and said, "Grandpa's having a rough day, huh?" Another mimicked shaky hands, making the others laugh louder. The waitress approached, chewing gum and looking irritated, shaking her head like this was a regular nuisance. "You okay, sir?" she asked, but her tone wasn't. One of concern it was drenched in condescension. Elijah didn't respond. He just slowly nodded, his eyes locked on the puddle of coffee spreading out like a quiet apology on the floor. He bent slightly, wincing, trying to pick up the largest piece of ceramic, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. His fingers betrayed him again. The waitress sighed, waved him off, and knelt to clean the mess herself. "You don't need to do that, hun," she said, but her voice was flat, her body language annoyed. Around him, the diner settled back into its murmur, but there was a different tone now. The subtle weight of judgment in the air. The kids kept giggling softly, and one of them took out his phone, pretending to take a picture. Elijah said nothing. No anger, no embarrassment on his face, just tiredness. A heaviness in his eyes that came from more than spilled coffee. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a few crumpled bills, slowly stood up to leave, moving like a man who had spent decades learning how to swallow humiliation without choking. Then, the bell above the diner door jingled. A man stepped in tall, sharp, and striking in full military uniform. Lieutenant Marcus Williams had just come from laying flowers at his father's grave in the veterans' cemetery 2 towns over. He wasn't planning to stop, but something about the place, maybe the warmth of the neon sign or just the weight of memory pressing down on him, pulled him in. As he stepped inside, his boots clicked against the floor and his eyes automatically scanned the room. The way soldiers often do, even when they're not on duty. That's when he saw him, Elijah. Standing awkwardly near the booth, preparing to shuffle away. At first, Marcus didn't recognize him. Then something caught his eye. The sleeve of Elijah's jacket had ridden up slightly, revealing a part of his forearm, a faded black ink tattoo, barely visible, blurred by time and weathered skin. But Marcus knew that symbol. He'd seen it once before, in an old photo his grandfather used to keep in his wallet tucked behind a picture of his wife. Skull circled by a panther, the emblem of the 761st Tank Battalion. The Black Panthers, the segregated tank unit that had stormed through Europe, earning honors, while still being denied respect. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward slowly, reverently, like he was approaching something holy. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice almost a whisper, not trusting his own emotions. "Excuse me, Sir May?" I asked, "Are you? Were you with the 761st? Elijah turned slowly, not expecting anyone to speak to him, certainly not someone in uniform. His eyes met Marcus's, and for a long second, nothing passed between them but silence and disbelief. Marcus stared down at the tattoo again. It was unmistakable. His chest tightened. His hands shook not with age, but with the weight of what he was seeing. Then, without hesitation, Marcus dropped to one knee, right there in the middle of the diner, and looked up at Elijah with tears already filling his eyes. "Sir, you're the reason I wear this uniform. My grandfather served under a man who pulled him out of a burning tank in Belgium. That man, he had that tattoo. He saved my family. He made me who I am." Elijah blinked, stunned, unsure how to respond. The room had gone utterly silent. The waitress froze. The teenager stopped laughing. Every eye was now on the 2 men, one young and proud, the other old and weary. Marcus took Elijah's shaking hand and pressed it to his chest over his own. "Heartbeat, thank you," he whispered. "I've waited my whole life to say that." Elijah's lips parted slightly, his voice barely audible. "You knew him?" Marcus nodded. "Every Sunday my granddad told me about a man with the steadiest Hands he ever saw. Even when bullets rained and tanks burned, your hands never failed. Elijah looked down at his own trembling fingers as if seeing them for the first time. A tear slid down his cheek. They don't work like they used to, he whispered. Marcus shook his head gently, his voice steady now. They already did. Their job, sir, more than anyone will ever know. And just like that, the room changed. No longer was Elijah just an old man with shaky hands. He was a hero, a warrior, a piece of forgotten history standing right there among them. People rose from their seats. The waitress removed her apron, eyes filled with guilt. The young adults stared in silent awe, their faces flushed with shame. No one laughed now, because in that diner, in that quiet, shattered moment, they weren't looking at frailty anymore. They were looking at greatness. The rumble of distant artillery never truly left Elijah's ears, not even decades later. It began as a low vibration in the chest, then rose into a crackling roar that swallowed the sky and shook the soul. Sound still haunted him, even in silence. His memories, long buried beneath layers of routine and aging skin, began to stir the moment Lieutenant Marcus Williams spoke the words, "Were you with the 761st?" Suddenly time folded. The smell of gunpowder and wet soil replaced the bitter coffee of the diner. The stained floor tiles turned to churned French mud. The weak sunlight filtering through dusty windows became the dull gray haze of a war-torn morning in Europe. 1945. He was there again, just 20 years old, standing shoulder to shoulder with black men who had been trained for battle by a nation that still refused to eat beside them. They had sailed across the Atlantic together, boys from Detroit, Atlanta, New Orleans, and Elijah from tiny Calhoun, Georgia. Most had never been out of their home counties, much less onto foreign soil, but they had been promised something bigger than themselves, a chance to serve, to be men, to finally be seen. But even in war, racism rode shotgun. Their unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, was elite, fierce, and disciplined. Yet they were given second-hand equipment, rusted tools, outdated tanks with thin armor. While white units were praised and paraded, the Panthers were told they were an experiment. Some generals didn't believe black soldiers had the courage for combat. The irony. They were soon thrust into the worst of it. From the Battle of the Bulge to the push into Nazi-occupied towns, the 761st was assigned the most dangerous, most brutal routes. Their bravery was not a matter of glory, it was survival. Elijah was assigned to a three-man crew in a Sherman tank nicknamed Midnight Roar. He was the mechanic and secondary gunner, responsible for keeping the tank alive. Under impossible conditions, and he did. Time after time, when fuel froze, treads cracked, or engines seized. It was Elijah's hands that brought them back from the brink, those same hands that would later tremble just from lifting a fork. One frigid night in March, near the outskirts of Wels, Austria, Elijah's unit was ordered to push through a heavily mined German road to clear the path for Allied supply trucks. The intelligence was flawed. Terrain was worse. It was supposed to be a minor skirmish, but it turned into a bloodbath. German 88mm cannons lit up the horizon. Tanks exploded in fiery blossoms. Screams were drowned out by metal tearing apart. Amid the chaos, Elijah's tank was hit on the right side, shrapnel piercing the hull, smoke flooding the interior. Commander, a white officer named Captain Howard Langston, barked orders even as he coughed up blood, having caught a piece of hot metal across his ribs. Langston had never hidden his prejudice. He'd once told Elijah, "You keep the damn machine running. It's what you people are good at." But war is the great equalizer. It strips away rank, class, and color until only the core of a man remains. The fire spread quickly. The smell of fuel mixed with blood was suffocating. Elijah, bleeding from his left thigh, kicked open the hatch and dragged the unconscious driver out first, coughing, vision blurry. The German snipers were still firing. Every second above ground was a death sentence, but Elijah didn't hesitate. He turned back into the burning wreckage, crawling on elbows and knees toward the sound of Langston's voice. Weak and muffled. Flames licked the interior walls. The heat was unbearable. Metal groaned and snapped. Elijah's gloved hands burned as he gripped Langston under the arms and pulled him through the hatch, one agonizing inch at a time. The captain's body was limp, heavy, his uniform smoldering. Elijah stumbled across the open field, bullets zipping past his ears, carrying Langston over his shoulder like a sack of bricks. When he reached the ditch on the side of the road, he collapsed on top of him, both men soaked in smoke, sweat, and blood. Elijah lay there for a moment, chest heaving, lungs burning, staring up at the pale Austrian sky. Then miraculously, Langston opened his eyes, blinked, confused, then looked at the black soldier beside him, the same one he'd ignored, insulted, and overlooked since basic training. His lips trembled as he muttered, "Why? ... Why'd you come back for me?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He simply looked at him, really looked at him, not as an officer, not as a racist, but as a man. Finally, he whispered, "Because you're still breathing." Langston didn't speak again, but tears slid silently from his soot-streaked eyes. That day changed everything. Word spread fast across the unit. Some called Elijah a fool for risking his life for a man who wouldn't have done the same, but others, black and white alike, looked at him differently after that. Not with pity, not even with respect, but with something deeper. Awe. In the weeks that followed, Elijah kept fighting. He repaired tanks under fire, navigated minefields, and stood tall in freezing cold with a rifle in his hand when fuel ran out. One night, after securing a small German village, his crew found a barn filled with starving prisoners, Jewish families, mostly women and children, barely alive. Elijah spent 3 straight days helping local medics build cots from scrap wood, boiling potatoes, and cleaning wounds. He gave his own boots to a boy who had none. He never spoke about it afterward. Didn't need to. But the war took its toll. One of his closest friends, Wallace Big Walt Jefferson from Louisiana, was shot by a sniper just 2 feet away from him. Another, Carlos James, who could sing gospel like an angel, was blown apart during a morning patrol. Elijah saw things that stained the inside of his eyelids. Every time he closed his eyes, the flash of flame, the cries of the dying, the roar. A vengeance came back, kept his letters short, mostly to his mother. Never told her what he was really seeing. Just said he was doing all right and that the food was better than expected. She never knew he cried himself to sleep in muddy foxholes. When the surrender finally came in May of 1945, Elijah stood at the top of a hill in Bavaria with 3 surviving crew members, staring down at what was left of a once proud town, now reduced to rubble. The war was over. But the battle for recognition had just begun. When they returned to the U.S., they were not met with parades. They were not celebrated. White soldiers were handed jobs, homes, scholarships. Elijah was given a bus ticket and a polite thank you. His medal, the Bronze Star, was mailed to him without ceremony. No reporter interviewed him. No photo was taken. He went home to Georgia and was told to use the back entrance of the train station. At a diner in Atlanta, a sign still read Colorado's in the rear. The uniform he had bled in meant nothing. Elijah packed it away in a box and never wore it again. He spent the next 70 years in silence. He didn't tell people about Captain Langston. He didn't mention the barn full of children. He didn't talk about Big Walt or Carlos or the men who never came home, swept floors, changed oil, and repaired old engines for small-town shops. He played his harmonica when the tremors allowed. His tattoo, once bold and clear, faded with age, but the memory remained sharp as glass. And so, when Marcus Williams, the grandson of that same Captain Langston, knelt in front of him in a rundown diner decades later, those memories came roaring back, not with bitterness, but with quiet truth. The past had returned, not to haunt him, but to finally honor him. Because Elijah Turner, soldier of the 761st, never needed a statue. He was the monument. When Elijah Turner returned home from the war, there were no banners waiting for him. No crowds waving flags, no bands playing in celebration. There was no parade, no medals pinned to his chest in front of cheering townspeople. There was only the hot Georgia sun, the same cracked sidewalks, the same segregated diner counters, and the same quiet reminders that in America, a black man in uniform was still seen as less than a white man in rags. He stepped off that train. in a freshly pressed uniform, cleaned and folded so precisely it would make his sergeant proud, but no one saluted. The only person waiting at the station was his mother, eyes wet, arms trembling as she pulled him into a hug that seemed to beg forgiveness for a world that would never treat her son right. Elijah had survived bullets, bombs, freezing nights, and burning tanks, but what waited for him back home was something colder: indifference. He knocked on doors, clutching his service papers and recommendation letters, but was told there were no openings, or worse, that folks might not feel comfortable hiring someone like him. Once, a white manager looked over his paperwork, saw the Bronze Star, raised his eyebrows and said, "They're giving those out to anyone now?" That moment hurt more than shrapnel ever could. The Veterans Administration, bloated and overwhelmed, barely acknowledged his service. He applied for health benefits, but his paperwork was lost multiple times. When he finally saw a doctor, he was told his nightmares and panic spells were just signs of stress, nothing serious. They didn't call it PTSD back then, especially. Not for black veterans. He was told to get some rest, handed a bottle of sleeping pills, and sent home. That was it. Just like that, Elijah was forgotten, I said, from the history he helped write. The medals he earned were stuffed into a shoebox under his bed. He never hung them. He never wore them. What was the point? They didn't pay the rent. They didn't stop the dreams. They didn't make him feel whole. He tried to move on. Took a janitor job at a local high school, quiet work, steady pay. He kept his head down, always early, never complained. Students liked him, though they didn't know his name. He was Mr. Turner, the man who fixed broken lockers and smiled kindly when kids got detention. I started helping out at the local church to repairing pews, unclogging sinks, rewiring flickering lights. He did it all quietly, never asking for thanks. He didn't talk about the war, not because he was ashamed, but because no one ever asked. People saw his steady hands back then and assumed he had lived a simple, peaceful life. They didn't know those hands had once stopped a tank from exploding, had carried 3 bleeding men through enemy fire, had gripped a rifle for days straight, in the cold of the Ardennes, with frostbite chewing at his fingers. And slowly, as the years passed, those hands began to betray him. It started subtly, slipping from his grasp, the occasional dropped wrench. Then came the handwriting, once sharp and neat, now crooked and barely legible. Doctors told him it was Parkinson's, a cruel twist for a man who had once been known for the steadiness of his grip. There was no cure, just medication, rest, and the long, humiliating process of watching himself slowly lose the very tools that once made him who he was. He never married. There had been a woman once, Clara. Sweet voice, eyes like warm amber. They wrote letters. While he was overseas, spoke of marriage, of a home, maybe a couple kids, but war changes everything. By the time he returned, he was different, quiet, easily startled, withdrawn. She tried to understand, but there was too much he couldn't say, and too much she couldn't see. Eventually, she moved on. Elijah let her go without a word. He didn't want to trap her in his silence. He lived alone after that in a small apartment above a corner grocery store. The landlord, a Korean war vet, gave him cheap rent out of respect. They rarely spoke, but when they did, it was always with a nod, a mutual understanding of battles that never really ended. Elijah never had children, but he found purpose in other ways. He fixed kids' bicycles for free. He brought groceries to elderly neighbors. He sat quietly on park benches, offering a warm good morning to anyone who passed by, even when few ever responded. He became a fixture in the town, not celebrated, just present, a ghost in plain sight. The kids called him the old guy with the army coat. No one knew the history stitched into every fiber and time. The world sped up around him. Technology changed, stores closed, faces came and went. But Elijah remained steady and still, until even his body began to slow beyond control. He had to stop working. The tremors worsened. His voice sometimes cracked mid-sentence.
Yes.
His harmonica, once his favorite evening companion, gathered dust on the bookshelf because his fingers could no longer press the notes. He refused help, though, refused pity. He never wanted to be seen as broken. When people tried to assist, He'd smile and say, "I've been through worse." And he had. Much worse. But the weight of being invisible, of having given everything, only to be forgotten, was a burden no one ever truly saw. Elijah Turner had been a hero, a soldier, a warrior. The cost of that title wasn't paid in medals or ceremonies. It was paid in lonely nights, and forgotten birthdays. In doctors' offices, where nurses mispronounced his name and never looked him in the eye. In decades of silence, where the only voice that remembered him belonged to himself. Yet, even with all that stripped from him, he never let bitterness take root, never let hate consume him. He chose service, kindness, humility. He lived a life of quiet sacrifice, even after the war was long over. That, perhaps, was his greatest act of heroism, not what he did on the battlefield, but how he endured afterward, with dignity, grace, and the kind of strength that never needed to be seen to be real. For a moment, after Lieutenant Marcus knelt in front of the trembling, war-worn hands of Elijah Turner, the diner was frozen in absolute silence, no silverware clinking, no whispers, not even the faint sound of the kitchen's sizzling grill. Every eye was locked on the soldier in uniform, still on one knee, looking up at the man who had once been written off as just another old, shaky black man in a dusty coat. The teenagers who had mocked Elijah earlier sat stiffly, their laughter now caught in their throats. Faces flushed with shame as they watched a decorated, confident military officer call this forgotten man, "Sir." Slowly Marcus stood, but his voice remained reverent. He turned to face the room, his hand still resting on Elijah's shoulder. And what he said next would burn itself into the memory of everyone who heard it.
Dad.
You all sat here and laughed at this man because his handshake, because he looks old, because you assumed he was no one. But you were mocking a war hero, a man who bled for this country before most of your parents were even born. He let that silence hang, heavy and stifling. This man didn't just serve, he saved lives. He saved my grandfather's life. That tattoo on his arm? That's the 761st Tank Battalion? The Black Panthers. One of the most courageous and overlooked units in U.S. military history. He carried injured men out of burning tanks. He dragged officers who called him slurs through sniper fire and kept fighting even after the war ended inside him. Mocked him for having the audacity to grow old in front of you. The shame in the room was unbearable now. The waitress stepped back, eyes wide, her face pale. Even the cook had come out from the back, holding a spatula, listening. Marcus looked around again, his voice gentler now, almost cracking. You want to take a picture of someone? Take a picture of this man. Take a picture of real bravery. Because this man, he is American history. And none of you even saw him. Elijah stood still, unsure of how to react, his eyes wide with something between sorrow and awe. His lips moved, but no words came out. Marcus gently patted his back and whispered, "They need to know, sir. Your story needs to be told." Then something shifted.
The manager.
An older woman with graying hair and tearful eyes walked out from behind the counter. She looked at Elijah like she was seeing him for the very first time, as if his entire silhouette had changed in the span of 5 minutes. "Turner," she said softly, "if I had known, I'm so sorry. Please, this meal, and any other meal you ever want, is on the house. For life." The entire room seemed to exhale, shoulders dropping, tears beginning to form in eyes too proud to blink. One by one, people began to approach Elijah. A woman placed her hand gently on his arm and whispered, "Thank you, sir." A young boy walked up nervously, clutching a crayon drawing, and handed it to him like it was the greatest honor of his young life. The same teens who had mocked him moments ago now sat silent, unable to meet his eyes, faces red with regret. Marcus stepped aside, allowing Elijah to stand tall on his own, not because he no longer needed support, but because the room needed to see him, not as fragile, not as broken, but as the resilient soul he truly was. By the time Elijah walked out of that diner with Marcus on one side and a small crowd following behind, word had already started to spread. A local reporter who had been eating breakfast in the back booth unnoticed had filmed the entire exchange. The video was online within an hour. By the end of the day, it had gone viral, millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments. Hashtags like hashtag thank you Elijah and hashtag 761 Saint Hero flooding every corner of social media. That evening, a local newspaper ran a headline that read, "They mocked him. Then they found out he was the hero they'd never been taught." Journalists began calling. Veterans groups reached out. Schools asked him to speak. The same town that had walked past him for decades was now begging to hear the stories they never knew they needed. But Elijah remained humble. He didn't want fame. He didn't need it. All he ever wanted was for someone to see him, truly see him for who he was and what he had done. And now, finally, someone had later that night. After the media buzz had quieted and the sun had sunk below the horizon, Elijah and Marcus sat together on a park bench, watching the fireflies dance over the grass. The old man held his harmonica in his lap, unable to play it now, but clutching it like a memory he wasn't ready to let go of. Marcus turned to him and said softly, "You changed my life, sir. And now, I hope this country can finally give you the honor you deserve." Elijah didn't respond right away. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on a distant echo only he could hear, gunfire in the past, laughter in the present, and maybe, just maybe, respect in the future. After a long moment, he whispered, almost to himself, "All I ever wanted was to be remembered, not for the war, but for the way I kept going." Marcus nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Now they will, Mr. Turner, they will." And in the stillness of that summer night, the world felt just a little more just. Not because the pain had been erased, but because the truth had finally been spoken. Asterisk. The clip from the diner spread like wildfire across the country. What started as a local moment captured on a smartphone had within hours transformed into a national story of reckoning and remembrance. News anchors spoke his name with reverence, Elijah Turner. World War II veteran, member of the legendary 761st Tank Battalion, and forgotten hero. Major networks aired the footage, looping the moment Lieutenant Marcus Williams knelt before him like it was gospel. By morning, Elijah's faded photo. From the 1940s, young, proud, dressed in his combat uniform with the 761st patch visible, was plastered across screens nationwide. Reporters flooded the town. Historians began digging. The world was finally asking the question that should have been asked 80 years earlier. Who was Elijah Turner? News crews showed up outside his modest apartment. Veterans organizations launched campaigns. Hashtags like hashtag Honor Elijah and hashtag Black Panther Battalion trended across social media. Young people, especially black youth, began to learn a part of history their textbooks had always ignored. People who had once walked past Elijah on the street without a glance were now standing outside his building, holding handmade signs. "Thank you, Elijah. You are our history." Real heroes live quietly, and Elijah, humble as ever, watched it all from his second-story window, eyes misty, unsure how to absorb the flood of recognition. For a man who had once returned from war to silence, it was almost too much noise to bear. Then came the letter from Washington, D.C., marked with the seal of the United States Congress. It was crisp, formal, and sincere. Beside it read, "On behalf of a grateful nation, we formally recognize the service and heroism of Staff Sergeant Elijah Turner, formerly of the 761st Tank Battalion. We are initiating an immediate review for posthumous Medal of Honor recognition. With the full support of military historians and surviving records from World War II, this review will include personal testimony, archived footage, and newly uncovered eyewitness reports from former fellow soldiers." Marcus Williams had helped gather the necessary documents, including his grandfather's wartime journal, which mentioned Elijah by name not once, not twice, but on over 15 different occasions, always describing him as the bravest man I've ever met. It turned out that Langston, the same captain Elijah had saved, had written a lengthy letter after the war, recommending him for a Medal of Honor. That letter was buried in a bureaucratic drawer, never processed, and lost to time, till now. And now, Congress was listening. But even more meaningful than the medals or media buzz was what happened next. Elijah received an invitation from the local high school, where he had once worked as a janitor for nearly 30 years. The new principal, a young black woman named Miss Carter, had seen the footage and immediately organized an all-school assembly. She called it a day to know our hero. Elijah hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't something he'd ever done. He had spent most of his life trying not to be noticed. But Marcus gently encouraged him. "They need to hear it, sir, from you." So on a cloudy Friday morning, Elijah put on his old army jacket, stitched and faded, but proudened, was helped up onto the stage in the gymnasium where hundreds of students, faculty, and staff sat in silence, waiting. He stood at the podium, gripping the edges slightly to steady himself, and began to speak in a quiet, raspy voice that trembled not from weakness. He told them about Georgia in the 1930s, about enlisting. At 16, about the men he fought beside, about the tank fires and the freezing nights and the friends he lost. He told them about racism in the ranks, about being told to sleep in the supply sheds while white soldiers rested in bunks. He told them about saving the life of a man who never once called him equal. And he told them, most of all, about coming home to silence, how he cleaned floors in the very halls where now his photo hung on every wall. As he spoke, there were no interruptions, no phones out, no side whispers, just tears. Even the toughest students, the ones who never cried for anything, sat with faces wet. Teachers wiped their eyes. Custodians in the back, men and women who had worked alongside Elijah for decades, bowed their heads in quiet pride. Then, as he finished, there was a moment of silence. No one clapped at first because applause felt too small, too shallow. But then, from the third row, a young girl stood up. She was maybe 14, skin dark like polished mahogany, her hair pulled into 2 tight braids, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She walked straight up to the stage, climbed the steps without permission, and wrapped her arms around Elijah with a tenderness that broke the room wide open. She held him tightly and whispered into his coat, loud enough for the microphone to barely catch, "You made me proud to be black." And with that, the entire gymnasium stood. The applause was thunderous. People wept openly. Staff members embraced each other. And Elijah, this quiet, humble man who had once eaten lunch in the janitor's closet, stood taller than he had in years, in the weeks that followed. The honors kept coming, but Elijah didn't change. He still rose early, still walked slowly to the corner market, still offered warm greetings to passers-by, but now strangers greeted him back. Children waved from porches. Veterans sent letters from across the country. The Smithsonian called requesting a video interview. Universities offered to name scholarships after him. An art school even painted a mural of Elijah in full uniform, hand extended, reaching not for a rifle but for a child's hand, symbolizing legacy. A bill was introduced in Congress to include the history of the 761st Tank Battalion in all federal school curricula. And in his hometown, they renamed the very high school where he once worked, Turner Memorial High. But Elijah never let any of it get to his head. When asked by a local reporter how it felt to finally be recognized, he smiled faintly and said, "Feels like rain on a field that's been dry too long. I'll take it, but I didn't do what I did for medals. I did it because I was there and we didn't run." That quote would go on to be engraved beneath a bronze statue of him unveiled just outside the school. And for the first time in decades, students began visiting that statue. It may be because they were told to, but because they wanted to. They wanted to learn, to understand, to remember. And every once in a while, if you stood near that statue on a quiet afternoon, you might catch the sound of something soft on the wind, like a harmonica playing blues just beneath the Georgia breeze. The sun hung low over the military base, casting a golden warmth over the crowd that had gathered, soldiers in crisp uniforms, school children clutching miniature flags, elderly veterans in wheelchairs, and civilians dressed in quiet reverence, all packed into neat rows beneath a wide white tent pitched on the field near the parade grounds. The American flag fluttered high above them, but today, all eyes were fixed not on the colors of the nation, not on the man being wheeled slowly across the grass toward the main stage, Elijah Turner. dressed for the first time in over 70 years in his full military uniform, restored, pressed, and gleaming with medals that he never asked for but finally received. His bronze star glinted faintly beneath the folds of his coat, and sewn proudly on his shoulder was the aged but unmistakable insignia of the 761st Tank Battalion, the roaring Black Panther poised mid-strike, no longer hidden beneath decades of dust and silence. Elijah didn't want a wheelchair, not for this moment. So as the band played a soft instrumental version of Lift Every Voice and Sing, he slowly, with trembling limbs and gritted teeth, stood up, one hand on his cane, the other gripping Marcus Williams' arm for balance. It took him nearly 5 minutes to climb the steps to the platform, every step a slow, quiet battle against time, gravity, and the wear of a life spent surviving. But no one rushed him. No one moved. The crowd stood completely still, watching. Not just a man walking, but a symbol rising. And when he reached the podium at last, a single soldier in the front row began to clap, then another, and another. And within seconds, the entire audience rose to their feet in a roaring, thunderous standing ovation, the kind reserved for presidents and legends, for giants and ghosts come home. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, shoulders back, weathered face lifted toward the horizon, as if absorbing the moment into every cell of his being. He had waited decades not for applause, but for acknowledgement now. As the wind carried the sound across the base, it felt like the weight of a century had finally been lifted off his shoulders. A general approached the podium, gray-haired and solemn, holding a small black box cradled in both hands. He opened it slowly, revealing the Congressional Gold Medal, engraved with Elijah's name and the emblem of the 761st. Staff Sergeant Elijah Turner, the general said, his voice tight with emotion, on behalf of a grateful nation, we honor you not just for your courage in war, but for your endurance in peace, for surviving the silence, for carrying the weight of injustice without ever laying it down on anyone else, and for proving that real heroism isn't loud, it's persistent. He handed the box to Elijah, who looked at it for a long time, before nodding once and whispering, "Thank you." The words were barely audible, but they echoed through the mic and into every heart watching. Then Marcus stepped forward, his uniform pressed, his posture rigid, but his eyes rimmed with unshed tears. He raised his hand and delivered a perfect, full salute, one crisp and sharp enough to cut through history itself. Elijah slowly returned the gesture, his hand quivering as it rose, but steady at the final beat. As Marcus lowered his hand, single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek, not from sadness, but from the impossible weight of gratitude. Because this was more than ceremony, this was restoration. Elijah turned to the crowd and looked out at them, not with pride, but with a quiet, almost mournful peace. In the front row sat children holding up handmade signs. "You are our hero." "Thank you, Mr. Turner." And one little girl with brown skin and tight curls held a drawing of him in his tank, with stars all around. Somewhere in the back, Clara, his once-lost love, now a silver-haired widow in a sky-blue dress, watched with a hand pressed to her heart. Their eyes met across the crowd. No words were needed. Time had passed. Yes, but some things were deeper than time. Behind him, the band played a slow march. Soldiers stood at attention. The flag snapped against the wind. And Elijah, looking over this unexpected farewell, whispered softly, almost too quietly for the mic to catch it, "They forgot me once, but they remembered just in time." The words weren't bitter. They were full of grace, full of quiet understanding. Because Elijah never wanted revenge for the years lost, he only wanted to be seen before he was gone. And now, as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows that danced across the field, he knew he had been. The camera panned slowly outward, capturing the full frame Elijah standing tall, surrounded by rows of silent soldiers, the American flag waving behind him, and the sounds of soft crying rising from the crowd like a hymn. The scene was no longer just about one man. It was about a country remembering something it had tried to forget. And as the final salute was given, and Elijah took Marcus's arm again to descend the stage, the crowd stood once more, not in applause this time, but in solemn silence, because this was not a performance. This was a homecoming asterisk. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Too many real-life heroes like Elijah Turner live and die in silence, their courage buried beneath time and neglect. By spreading this story, you help bring light to the forgotten and honor those who gave everything for a country that didn't. Always give back. Subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories that matter. Stories that move, inspire, and remind us of what true courage looks like. Let's make sure their names are never lost again. Let's keep their legacy alive.